Thank you very much, Chloe, for the very kind introduction. And so this talk is, it's actually, the timing is quite good because it kind of follows Eli's talk, for those of you who were here at that last talk of winter quarter, kind of touches on similar themes. And this is joint work with Samara Claire, who was a graduate student here, Yana Kupnikov, who was once an IPR fellow, Matt Lewandowski, a longtime co-author of mine, and John Ryan, who works a lot with Yana. And so I'm going to start by putting this in broad perspective of political parties to kind of understand the contemporary moment in which we find ourselves. And so I'm going to go all the way back to the founding. And at the foundings, there was a lot of you probably know, there was a lot of concern about political parties. So if you read the Federalist Papers, they talk a lot about the dangers of factions that pursue self-interest of the nations. Of course, political parties did not exist yet. So factions really were what became political parties. And then in his famous farewell address, George Washington said, "Parties' struggle for power was a frightful despotism that would endanger the nation." And so it's kind of an interesting context, because if we fast forward to modern political science, and specifically mid-century, 20th century political science, we have the complete opposite perspective. In fact, the big concern was that parties were too weak. And so this is a famous quote from a famous political scientist, Schachtschneider, who said, "Modern democracy is unthinkable save in terms of parties." And there was a famous report from the American Political Science Association in 1950, which really bemoaned the lack of strong parties. By the turn of the century, so right around the millennium, we saw people were really upset that parties weren't strong enough. This is a quote from an article that kind of summarized the consensus. "The scholarly consensus on contemporary American political parties and the electorate centers on party decline." So that's 22 years ago, or 21 years ago. If we fast forward to today, we get things like this. This was the article that Eli led, but it kind of gives you the idea here. "Political sectarianism in America, a poisonous cocktail of othering, aversion, and moralization poses a threat to democracy." So it's a very different perspective 19, 20 years later. Here are some recent book titles that we've seen: "Why We're Polarized," "Political Tribes," "Divided We Fall," "Demagoguery and Democracy," "Breaking the Two-Party Doom Loop." There's many, many others. If we do a search on the term affective polarization, which I'll define in a moment, we find over 2,500 articles written in the last 10 years that include that term. So this is really a huge area of research. So what is affective polarization? In the most simplest version, it's simply an answer to this question. And so it asks respondents to simply rate the Democrats or the Republicans party on a thermometer, where 0 is very cold and at 100 is very warm. So that's the basic measure. I'll talk a little bit about more measurement issues as I go along and talking about what we do. And if you look, this is a graph that Eli put up last time. It's the same graph from our paper. If you look at what's happened to this measure over time, this measure has been asked repeatedly since 1978 on the American National Election Study, you see this. And so the top line is in what you think of your party. So if I'm a Democrat, this is what I think of the Democrats. You can see it's just slightly below 75. Pretty good. I'm feeling pretty good about my party. If we look at what you think of the other party, we see a huge drop over time, right? So that in this last 2020 iteration, we see it was around 22, okay? And so that's really the animosity that I'm going to talk about, and that a lot of people talk about when they talk about partisan animosity. When people talk about affective polarization as a term, they usually take the difference between these two measures. The interesting thing about the difference is that if you take the difference between the midpoint 50 right now, the out-party dislike exceeds the in-party like. So we actually are at a point where out-party hate exceeds in-party love, which is quite interesting. But I'm going to focus again on animosity. I can explain later why I do that, but I'm going to just take my word for there's good reason to do that right now. And so what about the consequences, right? I've already kind of made clear that a lot of people talk about this. There's a lot written about this, popular books, academic works. And so what do we know about the consequences? There are dozens of articles that look at the social consequences. These are really cute. They're very innovative. They look at things like, oh, if my affective polarization or my animosity level rises, I don't want my child to marry somebody from the other party, or I don't want to live near somebody from the other party. And there are different types of social distance measures. Family relation tensions, right? If I'm really polarized, I don't want to have dinner with people from the other party. There's a paper showing that Thanksgiving dinners after the 2016 election were much shorter in cross-partisan contexts. I don't want to date. I don't want to live with people from the other party. So there's a lot of papers showing these types of things. There's also papers showing economic consequences. I don't want to hire somebody from the other party. I'll pay them less. I don't want to buy things that touch the other party. And I don't want to collaborate with people from the other party. Okay, so that's all interesting and important work. What do we know about the political consequences? Quite surprisingly, for a political scientist at least, we don't know very much. And this was a quote from a paper that is actually right now is forthcoming. So it's a brand new paper, and here's a quote from it. "Research investigating these potential political implications of affective polarization is scarce." It's quite surprising, and I'll explain a little bit why in a bit. But the worry, of course, is that voters who are very polarized will excuse anti-democratic behavior by their own party to defeat the other side, right? They privilege their own party so much that they privilege it over democratic processes. And that's really the concern. But interestingly, we don't really have a lot of evidence that there's a connection between this polarization and the privileging of party over democracy. It's a fairly understudied area. So what I'm going to do is very quickly, this is an entire book manuscript, so I'm going to try to kind of condense it into a kind of a few highlights. I'm going to just put out the predictions we have about conditional animosity effects. Okay, I'm not going to talk about any of the psychology behind it. I can talk about that later, with probably after the talk if somebody's interested. I'll then talk about our data, which was a 4-wave panel study. Then I'll talk about an experiment we did to isolate the origins of animosity. And to get you to the bottom line is that we find that animosity does have concerning political consequences, but we also argue that there's a unique type of pluralism, one between moderation and disengagement. That is that some people are very engaged and kind of ideologically extreme, and other people's are not. And we think that that divide, which is a very interesting divide to think about, can actually control factions in terms of democratic stability. Okay, so again, it's a little bit weird to just jump right to predictions and not talk about theory at all, but I think the data are more interesting than talking about psychology, especially to an interdisciplinary audience. And the predictions are actually they're quite intuitive. And so the first prediction is basically that animosity will matter. Animosity will positively correlate with opinions in the presence of clear party cues. That is, if I have a lot of animus towards the Republicans and I know where the Democratic Party stands on an issue, I'm going to follow the Democratic Party more than if I did not have a lot of animus towards the Republicans. The more I don't like the other party, the more I want to differentiate myself from that other party, if I know how to do that. Okay? If there are no party cues, if I don't know how to do that, okay, for something like ban on lobbyists is an example of an issue we looked at. It's not clear where the parties stand on banning lobbyists. Okay, even if I hate the Republicans, I don't know what to do, so I can't. That won't have an effect on my partisan opinions. So we expect no effect in that situation. And then the last prediction is that we do not expect an effect if there are direct personal consequences of an opinion. That is, even if I'm very high in animosity, I know what I should be doing, but making an opinion is going to have a really large direct effect on my life. I'm not going to worry so much about signaling my partisanship and affirming my identity, but instead I'm going to really think about what's best for my personal welfare. And that'll come back to be relevant when I talk about some of the data we collected. All right, so our inferential strategy. So we opted for an overtime approach with a panel of respondents over 2 years. So we spent a lot of time thinking about this, spent a lot of summers actually doing different types of pilots, because ideally we want to do this experimentally, because a lot of the problem in isolating the impact of animosity is that it's confounded with a lot of other things. There are lots of pros and cons, which again, I don't want to take the time to think about, but the major issue with using experiments in terms of manipulating animosity, that is where you would use an experiment where you would cause people to develop more or less animosity, is that we worried that it would cause a local average treatment effect. That is, it would affect a certain subset of partisans in an experiment that might not generalize to a general population treatment effect. And so that was, for those of you who didn't understand that, it's not that important, but the key point is that we didn't think that we could manipulate people experimentally over the entire continuum of partisans. And so instead we use this overtime approach. And so we had 4 waves of this panel. So it's the same respondents being interviewed over and over again. The first wave occurred in July 2019. That's where we measured animosity. The second wave in April 2020, which was early in COVID and the 2020 election. The third wave was October 2020 before the election, and the fourth wave in April, several months into Biden's term and a year into the pandemic. So the data was a national representative non-probability sample. So it's balanced and collected quota-based sample on census demographics. We found some sample attrition, but not nearly as bad as one might expect. We started with 3,345 partisans, so we exclude people who are pure independents here because we're interested in partisanship. Anybody who leans towards a party, though, they count as a partisan. The second wave, we had 74% return, the third wave, 66%, and the fourth wave, 61%. We try to adjust for all of these things in different analyses. In terms of retaining, we retain more women, more people who are older, politically interested people, but it stayed generally representative over time. So we were quite pleased with that. So the animosity measure, what we did is we used 4 different items. One was the thermometer that I already told you about, which is just a scale of 0 to 100, how cold or warm do you feel towards the other party. We also did trait assessments of the other party. That is, do you think the other party is honest, intelligent, selfish? Okay, so higher scores there would be you think more positively of them. How much do you trust the other party to do what's right for the country? And then finally, a social distance battery, which is what I kind of intimated about before. For example, how upset are you to have neighbors from the other party? So we took these items. Okay, there's a bunch of items in each of these scales other than the thermometer one. And then we scaled them. They scaled quite well with an alpha of 0.88. They all factor analyzed onto one dimension. And then we flipped it. So higher scores have higher animosity, and we standardized it on a 0 to 1 scale. I said before, we're focusing on animosity for particular reasons, which I could talk about theoretically the reasons, but in terms of empirically, we do always control for in-party favoritism as well, which does not have a substantially large impact on anything we find. I want to give you well, before I go to this slide, I want to just give you some context of what happened over the two years that we've collected these data. So you want to brace yourself because it's also the 2 years of our lives, and it's quite exhausting to even think about. So with that in mind, this is the political. I'll first do the political highlights, and then I'll do the COVID highlights. So politically speaking, our first wave was in July 2019. So think way back. This is what was really big in politics back then. Trump disparaged 4 Democratic congresswomen. That was getting all the news at that point in time. Seems like ancient history, right? Okay, well, for good reason, right? Because between then and the end of our data collection, we had Trump impeachment -- 1. Our second collection came in April 2020, which was in the middle of the Democratic nomination battle. We were right in the field actually when Sanders stepped out. In May and June, we saw George Floyd's murder and the protests. In September and then October, when we collected our third wave, Justice Ginsburg died and Barrett was appointed. Then a lot happened between our third and fourth waves, right? We had a presidential election, we had a Capitol insurrection, we had another impeachment trial, and then we had passage of state voting restrictions, and there were bills by the time we were collecting our data in some 30 states or something along those lines. Okay, so that was our political lives over the last 2 years. Now let me tell you about our COVID lives over the last 2 years. Okay, so when we collected the data, and this is a really important point, there was no COVID. Okay, it didn't exist when we put this data in when we first collected our animosity measure. First COVID case in the US was in January. The pandemic was declared in March. We did our second data collection in April when the first states were starting to reopen. In October, Trump, and this is our third wave, Trump gets COVID. US had over 200,000 deaths. And between our third and fourth waves, again, a lot happens. FDA approves a vaccine. The Delta variant is detected. First states start to lift all restrictions. And then when we were collecting our data, all adults became eligible for the vaccine in all states, okay, and so on and so forth. So that's a lot of stuff that happens over our data collection. Okay? So we were going to leverage a lot of this stuff actually in terms of what we analyzed. So first, a little bit of detail on our animosity measure. This is the overall distribution of our measure. This graph is the distribution with the x-axis is just the animus scores from on kind of percentile basis from 0 to 1. And the thing to note about this, and this will come up again at the end, is you see a pretty long tail at the end. There's a pretty substantial number of people that are in the top 30% of animus on the animus scores. So that's kind of interesting. That means there's a fair distribution of people pretty high up there. Perhaps even more interesting was in the fourth and final waves of our data collection, we re-asked all of the animus questions again. And we wanted to look at stability over this 2-year period. And we found really quite remarkable levels of stability. You can see the graph demonstrates a very high level of stability. It's as stable as things like people's self-reported health, their religious identification, and so on and so forth. So there's a really high level of stability, at least in the time of our data collection, despite all of these things happening in the country. So in the results that I'm going to focus on, our independent variable is really the percentiles on this animosity measure, because there's not an actual metric for animosity per se when we created the scale. So we're really interested in what percentiles, as you get to a higher percentile, meaning you have more animosity relatively, what does that do to your opinions on different things? Okay. Don't read this table. This is the table that one puts up to show like, oh, well, we did a lot. Okay, so we did do a lot, but I'm going to focus on 2 things that we looked at. Okay, one thing is COVID-19. Okay, and the other thing is our democratic norms and anti-democratic partisan behaviors. And I'm going to show you selected results from those different analyses that we did. But we measured all kinds of things. We also looked at issue positions, actor evaluations, and partisan compromise. And then you can see we did this over various different waves. So there was a lot of different data to look at. But now that you've probably just started to read that table, I'm going to skip over it. And so let me start to COVID-19. So COVID-19 was a particularly interesting thing for us to study, because one of the issues with using survey data to study the impact of animosity is you never know for sure if the issue positions themselves cause the animosity, right? Like I might be a Democrat. I really don't like what Republicans are doing on COVID-19, so my animosity about Republicans goes up. I find a relationship between animosity and my position on COVID, it could be animosity driving the position, or it could be the position driving animosity. But in this case, because we measured animosity before COVID existed as an issue, we can rule out that possibility, and we can rule out the possibility that what elites did on this issue could have affected my animosity levels in July 2019. So it was a particularly interesting issue to look at. The other thing is, as we all know, there were very clear partisan cues on this issue. This is just a graph of state regulations. And as you can see, all the blue states were putting in regulations early in COVID. And then you even have this large group of red states out here who never put in any regulations around COVID. Okay, so there were very clear cues. So I'm going to put up a bunch of selected results. All of the results are just plotting the impact of animosity on these particular outcomes that I'm going to mention. They're all generated from predicted values from models that do a lot of different things, but I don't want to show you all of those messy tables. And so the first thing I'm going to show you is just mask wearing. Okay, so we all are very familiar with mask wearing. It might stretch your memory to remember this, but in April 2020, when we did our second wave, the CDC had just suggested it. The parties had not actually taken clear positions on mask wearing at that point in time. Fauci had been very unclear about if you should be wearing masks or not. Right, he had this worry about masks being taken up and healthcare workers not having enough masks. And so what we find, right, on the x-axis is the animosity level. This is merging. I'm sorry, this is not merging parties. This is the animosity level. This is the likelihood of somebody saying that they wore a mask, which is what we asked them. And you see the Democrats, more of them wore masks. The Republicans, fewer of them wore masks. But there's no relationship with animosity. Okay? It wasn't as people got more animus towards the other party, they didn't become more or less likely to wear a mask. Okay? So as we move through the pandemic, right, to our second two waves, as we all know, mask wearing became extremely polarized, with Democrats encouraging preventive behaviors like mask wearing and Republicans being against preventive behaviors like mask wearing. And what we see in the other two waves is we see these strong polarization effects, right? So we see Republicans who are very low in animus, they actually were wearing masks even more than Democrats. But as Republicans get more and more animus, right, we see they drop precipitously in terms of the likelihood of them wearing masks. Okay, so we see this pretty large polarization amongst Republicans. As they come to hate Democrats more, they become more and more less likely to wear masks. Okay, Democrats, we see an effect. It hits a bit of a ceiling, right, because you can't be more than perfectly likely to wear a mask. But you still see somewhat a significant effect, so that as they hate Republicans more and more, they're significantly more likely to be wearing a mask. Okay? I focused on mask wearing here. We asked about 15 different behaviors, and we find the same type of trend across all of these behaviors, and if we merge them. Although the mask wearing is particularly interesting since the lack of cues early on in the pandemic. Okay? You might remember another prediction that we put forth is as the personal consequences of a decision become very severe, you're less likely to follow this partisan cue, no matter what your animosity level is. So COVID again presented us with a great opportunity to test this because people had variation in the extent to which they were personally vulnerable to COVID-19. So in our first survey, in our second wave, the first time we were asking about COVID-19, we also looked at the number of cases or the number of deaths, which were correlated at 0.99 in the respondent's county. And our prediction then was, if you were in a county that had a high number of cases or deaths, animosity should have a much less of an effect on your opinion, right? Because suddenly you're in this situation where the decision has grave personal consequences. And so first I'm going to look at the low consequence cases, right? So low consequences meaning you're in a county that does not have a lot of cases or deaths yet. This is from our April 2020. So if you look at we'll start with Republicans. If you look at Republicans, you see this huge polarization. I'm sorry, I'm not looking at mask wearing anymore. we changed DVs here. So we're looking now at policy opinions. Okay? Could be mask wearing, it looks the same. These policies are like, do you think that essential businesses or non-essential businesses should close down? Do you think schools should go virtual and things like that? Okay, so they're restrictive policies. So I'm sorry, I missed that we shifted outcome variables here. But regardless, if you look at the low cases, so this is a case where Republicans are not having a lot of cases, you see this massive polarization. So as Republicans come to hate Democrats more, they become more and more likely to oppose any health protective policies in their state or their locality. In contrast, Democrats, again, you're running up a little bit about a ceiling, but you're still seeing right around the 50th percentile, they start to go up. So you're seeing a little bit of an effect, a nonlinear effect, but still somewhat of an effect in these low case cases where Democrats, as they come to hate Republicans more, they become more and more supportive of these health preventive policies. Then if we turn to the counties, yeah, Greg.
Those more trait-like tendencies versus the associations that you're hypothesizing.
Yeah, so we put in, so
Sorry, can you just repeat the question?
yeah, great. So Greg asked, to what extent are we controlling for individual attributes such as health, emotional stability, other types of individual attributes that might affect their responses? Is that a fair characterization? So it's a great question. So we did, in all of these models, we did have a series of controls that looked at things like their economic hardship that they were experiencing. We looked at their childcare situation. We looked at if they were immunocompromised. We controlled for that. We looked at if there was any pregnancy in their home or if they were pregnant themselves. We also looked at if they had somebody they know who became infected by COVID or who had died by COVID, and their perceived severity of that person being affected, or if they hadn't been affected, their anticipated severity. And it's a particularly insightful question because actually what we ended up doing, I wasn't going to talk about this, but later in the pandemic, when everybody's surrounded by cases, we don't expect cases to have this moderating impact, well, that I'm about to show you. And so we actually anticipated correctly, fortunately, for us at least, that the moderator would no longer be cases, but self-reported severity of your COVID-19 experience. And so in that sense, it did become it became the key moderator in having an effect, to the extent that that measure captures some of those things. But we didn't control for everything that you probably would have wanted us to control for, because we just didn't include all those health items. But we were.
Yeah, there's this concept which is how likely you are. Sorry. There's this psychologists think a lot about called neuroticism or emotional stability,
Yeah.
which is about basically like how much negative emotion do you show in response to events around you? Are the type of person who experiences a lot of anger, a lot of depression, a lot of anxiety? And I'm wondering about that in particular, but I won't belabor the point.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. We didn't have a direct measure of, actually, we didn't control for a direct measure of anxiety here. We put a lot of stuff on these surveys. So there's a possibility that we might have had some imperfect constructs about anxiety around COVID-19. We did ask people to predict the number of deaths, which would also be a kind of imperfect, but something to get at that. So it's a great point. We might be able to do more with that. So I just showed you the effect of animosity on support for different COVID policies. Now I'm going to look at situations where there are a high number of cases. And what you see here, I'm sorry, the graph includes all the lines and I should have taken it out, but this dotted line is the Democrats in high number of cases. You see there's a little bit of animosity effect for Democrats, but it's generally pretty flat. And if you look at Republicans in a high number of cases, you can compare that situation with the low number of situation. They actually start to go up. We don't know why. They actually started to go up in supporting policies in a high number of cases when they got more animus. We don't know why more animus would lead you to become more supportive. But generally speaking, as you were in a higher case situation, that moderated the effect of animosity. Okay? And we found this type of effect across lots of different measures. And again, as Greg anticipated, we switched this to perceived severity of COVID-19. And that's what we found to moderate things in the subsequent waves of the survey. All right, so to summarize our COVID results, so we found similar results when we looked at your worry about COVID-19, the perceived safety of different activities from COVID-19, a whole range of behaviors, as I mentioned, evaluations of figures. It was actually quite interesting to watch how evaluations of Dr. Fauci changed over waves, because at first he wasn't politicized, and he became very politicized. So it was kind of like the mask finding that I put up before, and vaccines as well. And so if you're interested in those findings, I could share those with you at another time. Our point of course, there have been dozens, if not more, papers showing partisan divides on COVID-19. And our point is to us really quite importantly different. Our point is not that the parties differed. That's easy to see. Our point is that a lot of this difference stemmed from this animosity, which has implications that I'll talk about. We also found conditions. There were no effect when there were no clear cues. And there was, it should really say, less of an effect when their personal stakes were high. It also, as an aside, reveals the consequences of mixed or poor messaging and animosity. As we all know, the US really sidelined a lot of experts, and even those who weren't sidelining experts were not sending the most clear messages about COVID-19, and it had fairly dire consequences. Let me skip to democratic principles now, the other outcome that I said I'm going to look at. So I'm going to specifically talk about democratic norms, which are maintained through social sanctions and rewards. And ideally, voters reward those who uphold norms, and they punish those who do not. And the concern, of course, is that politicians will flout norms when they benefit from them. Like, we can't trust politicians to do this. And so the prediction, though, is as animosity increases, partisans will sacrifice norms to help their party, right? They're going to privilege party over country. And so, but the interesting caveat in terms of our data collection is it depends on who holds the executive. And I'll get to that in a moment. But one of the other interesting things about our data collection is when we started the data collection, the Republicans held most of government. And when we ended our data collection, the Democrats held at least the Senate and the presidency. So we're going to exploit that. So this is a pretty straightforward finding. Okay, we ask a bunch of questions on this. So this was from October. This is just before the election. If your party wins, is it okay for your party to block court nominees from the other party? And as we see, as animosity increases, so saying that it's okay to block nominees from the other party, we see that for both parties, it goes up significantly with animosity. Democrats are generally higher, likely because we were asking this right after Barrett had just been appointed. So that's going to raise their feelings immediately. But we see kind of this very straightforward effect. Okay. We also asked people, which was unfortunately fairly prophetic, but we asked people, what would be the legitimacy of challenging the election if your candidate lost? And then we varied, lost by this much in a key state. And so what we find is that when we merge, I'm going to merge the parties here in this graph, but when we say that your nominee lost by 1,000 votes, we see as animosity goes up. We're not quite sure why this happened, but as animosity goes up, kind of from the midpoint, it becomes more and more legitimate, all the way to very legitimate to challenge the outcome of the election. If you lost by 10,000 votes, it would become, you still see a strong animus effect. And if you lost by 100,000 votes, you still see a strong animus effect. So again, challenging the election, it's not that partisans think it's okay to challenge the election. For us, it's that animosity is leading people to think that's more okay to challenge the election. Okay, finally, this is perhaps the most interesting, checks and balances. So this is an abstract question. How much do you think checks and balances are, or do you agree that checks and balances are important to American government? So first, we're going to look at the results when your party is out of power. Okay, so in 2019, the Democrats were out of power. What does animosity do? It's not a large effect, but it is a significant effect. That's the dark line right there. I'm sorry, actually that is the dark line right there. As Democrats become more and more, have higher and higher animosity, they become more and more likely to strongly agree that checks and balances are important. Of course, they want to check and balance Trump. Okay? Republicans in 2021, when Biden is president, that's this light dotted line, right? It's only as animosity becomes higher, they think checks and balances are more important. Okay? So Republicans suddenly really love checks and balances when Biden becomes president. What about when the party is in power? Okay? These are the same respondents. Okay? These are the same people. Okay? So Republicans in 2019, when they're in power, as they become more and more animus, that's that thin gray line right here. Not a huge effect, but somewhat of an effect. The more animus the Republicans have when they were in power, the less they like checks and balances. Democrats, when they're in power, this is perhaps the largest effect, this is this dotted line. It's only Democrats in 2021, when Biden's president, the more animus they have, they suddenly are ready to kind of say checks and balances are less important. Okay? So again, we see animosity has this substantial impact on what you're thinking about democratic norms, okay? Depending on who's controlling government. So to summarize those results, we find similar things on gerrymandering, arresting other party protesters, expanding oversight of the other party, and so on and so forth in the non-abstract scenarios. For the abstract scenarios, we found similar results on separation of powers, institutional respect for like the media, and executive power. Conditions, it's contingent on party cues, specifically who controls the executive, so what you're hearing about this. But it is important, if you were paying really close attention, the norm support does tend to be middle to high. So they weren't really low support for norms. So that's kind of an important thing to point out. So I'm going to give you an overall summary, and then I'm going to come to the twist in kind of our argument. So we find evidence of political effects of animosity on COVID-19 reactions and democratic principles. We found similar, if you remember that messy table I put up, we find similar results on policy attitudes, actor evaluations, and partisan compromise. We find the effects are contingent on the nature of party signals and whether there are clear personal consequences. And one thing I have not mentioned, but if you were really looking closely at the graphs, it is quite interesting to us that nearly all the effects are concentrated at the top of the distribution, really the top 30%. And these top 30% is we dig very deeply in the data. What do these 30% look like versus the other 70%? And they actually look quite different. And I can talk about that later if anybody's interested. Okay, so is this worrisome? For one, we think it's interesting because we didn't know a lot about animosity effects before. Should we be really worried about this? So one immediately say yes, partisans privilege partisan ends over democratic means and substantive considerations when it comes to COVID. Traditional sources of pluralisms have faded, right? For those of, especially political scientists, we'll get this. Ideological and social sorting mean the parties are a lot more homogenous ideologically and social demographically. So they look a lot more different from one another. And the concern is that it undermines the focal point of democratic stability, right? We don't hold officials in line. But I'm going to go through a three-pronged argument that's not going to completely lessen the concern that you might have, but it's going to give a little bit of a twist to how to think about these concerns. The first step is I'm going to talk about animosity and the relationship with non-electoral actions. Then I'm going to talk about perceptions of the other side's ideology and engagement. And then I'm going to talk about the impact of those perceptions on animosity. Okay. First, we ask a question. Would you break the law in response to your candidate losing an election or in response to a protest that you disagree with? Okay, so we asked that question and we looked at the impact of animosity on the likelihood of you breaking the law non-violently. And we see this is actually just short of statistically significant, but it's a very slight relationship. So in other words, animosity is not having a very sizable effect on the likelihood of people breaking the law in order to advance their political goals. We also ask people the likelihood of them engaging in violence, okay, and if their candidate lost the election, or if there was protests that they were against. And we find here a totally flat line with animosity. So the important point here that I want to make is animosity does not necessarily lead to extra systemic behaviors. We think that things that do lead to extra systemic behaviors are like anti-establishment orientations, which are fairly orthogonal or sometimes even inversely correlated with animosity. Because if you have animus, you're within the political system. And so that's our first point that we want to make. The second point, and this is something Eli put up last 2 weeks ago, people have vast misperceptions about the other party. So we also asked people their own ideology and how engaged they were with politics, specifically how often they talked about politics. And then we asked people how much they think the other party does that. And so if you just look at this is the question of how often do you think the other party speaks about politics? People perceive that 64% of the other party talked about politics frequently. Okay? We also looked at posting politics on social media. It's a pretty similar result. In reality, only 27% of partisans talk about politics frequently. So we're seeing this massive misperception of what the other party does. We also asked them to the perception of the ideology of the other party. And we found that 69% of people thought the other party were extremists. That is extreme liberals or extreme conservatives, depending on the party, when in fact, only 38% are. Okay? So we have these very large misperceptions of what the other party is. In fact, if we combine these categories, partisans overestimate ideologues who frequently discuss politics by a factor of 3.5. Okay, who cares? Okay, why does this matter? Because that affects animosity. Okay, I'm just going to go back to the thermometer rating. I could use our combined measure, but it's kind of easier to follow with just the thermometer rating. So if I just pull out the thermometer rating, what we did is we did an experiment where we asked people, remember in the thermometer rating, historically, you ask people to rate the Democrats and the Republicans. And when we ask people to do that, you end up at 32. Okay? If we substitute Democrats and Republicans, which is very cold, right? That's a lot of animus. If we substitute instead of asking about Democrats and Republicans, what would you write an extreme Democrat or Republican who frequently discusses politics? You also get a 32. So in other words, when you're asking about Democrats and Republicans, people are imagining the extreme engaged partisan. Okay? They're not imagining the actual modal partisan. The actual modal partisan is a moderate who occasionally discusses politics. And when you ask people about that explicitly, they're actually fairly indifferent. They come in at 47%. Okay, kind of like okay, no big deal, right? That's a pretty large drop of 15 percentage points in terms of animosity. You move from indifference to being a fair amount of animosity. And then if you ask them about moderates who rarely discuss politics, you actually like them more than you dislike them. Okay, and this is all from the other party. Okay? And we get similar results if I use my whole aggregated animosity measure. All right, so those are the 3 steps I wanted to make. Now let me talk you through the implications of those steps because it's probably not totally evident what all of this adds up to. One is that what animosity does do is it leads to extreme responses. For example, in COVID-19, excusing democratic norm violations. Now, if perceptions were accurate with the other side actually existing of engaged ideologues, then that concern about pluralism would be quite warranted. right? Like if I'm a Democrat and I'm actually accurate that all Republicans are ideological and quite engaged in politics, I might not be so off to privilege my party over democracy. Okay? Maybe that's not a bad idea. In fact, we also ask people how much they perceive the other party to be likely to break the law or engage in violence. Okay? And these people who I have showed you have a lot of misperceptions, especially when they're high in animus, so this is high in animus, they really perceive, this is the dark lines, you can ignore the other two lines, they really perceive that the other party is going to break the law or engage in violence, right? If you're at the top of the animus scale, you're almost like somewhat thinking it's somewhat likely that the modal other partisan is going to engage in violence. If I actually really think that, I probably should start privileging my party over democracy because things are not looking so good for me. But what I showed you is that that reality is not true, right? Even the highest animus members of each party are not particularly likely to break the law or engage in violence. All right. So the problem here is that misperceptions about animosity leads partisans to accept representatives who violate democratic norms. And to kind of put this a little bit in context, here's a quote from a 1997 article that a political scientist, Barry Weingast, wrote about democratic stability. And this was a footnote in the article because it was kind of like not a big deal, right? Obvious. The US Constitution has provided binding in practice, has proved binding in practice, partly because citizens are willing to defend it by reacting against proposed violations. Anticipating that reaction, political leaders rarely attempt violations. Citizens' reactions imply that US constitutional restrictions on elected officials are self-enforcing. Okay? That was 1997, so it was just 25 years ago. Okay? In 2022, it seems that partisans are no longer as likely to react against proposed violations, largely because of this high animosity driven by misperceptions. In other words, this coordination focal point that we have arrived at, or that we want to be at, where we punish democratic violations, is becoming somewhat undone because these high animus partisans are misperceiving the other side. And that is a serious threat to maintaining democratic stability because it's giving a lot of leeway to elites to do what they want. So what's the solution? There's no simple solution. So I'm not going to come here and say, here's what we should do. But the thing that we think is kind of intriguing is that there is a pluralism between the engaged and the not so engaged citizen, right? If you go back to that graph of perceptions that I showed you before, one thing that I didn't emphasize but should be evident from what I did emphasize is that most partisans are fairly not engaged and fairly not very ideological. Okay? Now, for political scientists sitting in the room, right, this is something that is really bad, right? For political science, like for 70 years, they've been upset that citizens are not engaged and ideological enough. But in fact, that's probably a good thing, right? Because if everybody was engaged and ideological enough, you'd end up in today's era, because of sorting, you'd end up with two very extreme different sides that are actively engaged in undermining one another. So if we can correct the misperceptions that the other side is so engaged and ideological, that would lower animosity and it would lower the exclusion of elite abuse of power. So basically, the 3 points of argument that I was trying to make, if you're still following me, because I know it's a little bit nuanced though, is that people have high animosity. That high animosity is concerning because it lets them excuse behaviors of elites. It is not concerning because they're actually going to do anything with that animosity. They're not necessarily likely to take extra systemic actions. That animosity that's concerning because of accountability is driven by misperceptions. If we can correct those misperceptions so people realize that a lot of citizens are not meeting this ideologically engaged partisan, animosity would potentially drop down and they'd be less likely to excuse behaviors. Or put more simply, if I suddenly no longer think that the other side is so foreign and so concerning that I can't imagine living with them anymore and I'd rather sacrifice democracy, if I can correct that so that they realize, oh, that's actually not quite that extreme, I will no longer excuse the elite behavior that might be being done amongst my party. And so a few other things to add, but Tony? Oh, no, I'm sorry. I thought you were wrapping up. Oh, I am wrapping up, but I have one more slide. So the question is, how do we do this? It's not entirely straightforward. There is a large amount of work, and I've been on a few things that do this. You can, in the short term, correct these misperceptions, and they seem to work. And so if you come along and you tell people, oh, actually, you're not perceiving this right, this is the perceptions, this is the actual distribution that people are finding, people do seem to adjust their behaviors on a whole host of things, including support for democratic norms, partisan violence, and so on and so forth. Whether those solutions are robust, though, is very unclear to me. So one thing that nobody has done, right? The typical experiment is oh, right, if you go back to that graph and people think the other side's really likely to become violent, and you tell them, oh no, they're actually not likely to be violent, people are like, oh, okay, I won't be violent either then. But it's not clear that that would hold up if there was competitive rhetoric, right? And suddenly your party saying like, no, actually the other side is that violent. So I don't know if that's really a real solution. A more complex solution would involve including the causes of kind of these misperceptions. And when we think about the causes of these misperceptions, they're not well understood. I mean, the things that immediately come to mind is an over-reliance on social media by people who use social media themselves, but also the journalists who actually have come to rely on social media portrayals instead of scientific polling in a lot of cases. We can think about cohort change. There's a fair amount of work looking at kind of millennials and kind of different values that they carry forth, but that's complicated as well because you also find that as people age, they tend to become more effectively polarized or have more animosity. So it's a little bit unclear if lower levels amongst the younger people if that's going to change or not. So that's kind of an open question. So to conclude and kind of then open it up, so there's massive worry about animosity in general. There have been since the founding. It's very, very high today. The political consequences, though, empirically speaking, have been fairly unclear. We document political consequences, but we also find that it's conditional on cues, motivations, and it's concentrated amongst those with the most animus. High animus partisans are not more likely to particularly act, so they're not necessarily an imminent threat. But high levels of animosity from misperceptions can provide elites leeway, and the concern is about elites exploiting that leeway beyond just gridlock in government, but even doing more damaging things. And so the solution, although I again, unfortunately don't have the exact way to go about doing this, is to try to think about these misperceptions that people are forming in their minds, which again, we unfortunately don't have historic data on this, so we don't know if they've become more misperceived over time, but we think it's a pretty fair guess to think that they probably have, given the evolution of parties themselves and of communication technologies. And so with that, I will we'll take Tony's question. So thank you.